The OSI model. What is the OSI model? Well, it stands for the Open Systems Interconnection Model, and it was developed all the way back in 1977 by the International Organization for Standardization. This organization is responsible for creating different standards, which we refer to as the ISO, and there's some number usually behind it. For example, if you see ISO 7498, that's the standard we use to refer to the OSI model. Now, for the exam, you don't have to go and worry about memorizing the ISO number, but I did want to introduce you to this concept because in everything we cover in computing, there's some sort of standard associated with it. Now, in the case of the Open Systems Interconnection Model, most people simply call this the OSI model, but you may sometimes hear it referred to as the OSI stack. Either way, we're talking about exactly the same thing here. The OSI model is extremely important to the Network Plus exam because it's a fundamental thing that we use to discuss all the pieces and parts of a network. It's so important that you're going to see a lot of questions on the Network Plus exam about this concept and how it relates to other things. The OSI model is made up of 7 different layers, and we're going to talk about each of these 7 layers in the next 7 videos, covering 1 layer per video because this model is just that important to understanding our networks. Now, as we work through this section of the course, we're going to be focused mainly on Domain 1, Networking Fundamentals, specifically Objective 1.1, which states that we must be able to compare and contrast the Open Systems Interconnection, or OSI model layers, and the encapsulation concepts. We're also going to briefly jump into Domain 5, Network Troubleshooting, towards the end of this section, because I'm going to use a network tool called Wireshark to help show you how we can break down the data that's transferring over our networks into various layers of the OSI model. This tool, Wireshark, is specifically listed under Objective 5.3, which states, given a scenario, use the appropriate network software tools and commands. Wireshark is a really helpful tool that's used a lot in troubleshooting, but even the OSI model itself can be helpful as a framework to think through when you're doing your troubleshooting too. These 7 layers of the OSI model are useful when you're trying to troubleshoot a network because if I have a problem and I can think about it from all the different 7 layers, I can start to identify exactly where the problem is, and then I can troubleshoot it appropriately. This means the OSI model can also serve as a reference model. Now, you may be wondering, what's the exact purpose of a reference model? Well, a reference model is simply something that we use to categorize the functions of a network into a particular layer, and that's what we're going to use the OSI model for during our troubleshooting efforts. Now, when you start looking at the OSI model in depth, you're going to start to notice that the OSI model doesn't actually cleanly or easily or accurately refer to the way our modern networks actually operate these days. For example, some things are going to operate at multiple layers of the OSI model, especially when we're discussing the upper 3 layers. Now, there's a good reason for why the OSI model isn't perfect for our way that networks operate today, and that's because our networks operate under a model known as the TCP/IP model. But the OSI model was designed to refer to how all networks operate, not just TCP/IP networks. Now, I know that may be a little bit confusing, but don't worry too much about it yet. It's going to make a lot more sense as we go through the OSI model and the TCP/IP model. After we talk about all 7 layers of the OSI model, we'll go back and compare the OSI model and the TCP/IP model in the next section of this course, and you'll see what I mean. But to keep things simple for right now, let's just remember that the OSI model is a reference model, and we're going to use it in our network operations and troubleshooting because, again, it's generic in nature, and it's going to allow us to work for any and all networks we may have, not just our most common networks, which are TCP/IP. Now, one of the benefits of using a reference model like the OSI model is that it can be used equivalently across lots of different technologies and a lot of different manufacturers as well. So if I'm going to look at a particular wireless network card for my computer, I can compare how it operates through the 7 layers of the OSI model and then compare it equivalently to a different manufacturer's card. When you can understand the functions at each and every layer that's being performed, it's going to help you better understand the flow of data in the network and through that card and how it communicates and how you can troubleshoot it. Now, I've mentioned that there are 7 layers of the OSI model several times in this video already, but I still haven't even showed you what they are. So let's take a look at the 7 layers of the OSI model. First, we start at the bottom layer, working our way from layer 1 all the way to the top layer, which is known as layer 7. These are the physical layer, the data link layer, the network layer, the transport layer, the session layer, the presentation layer, and the application layer. For the exam, you need to be able to remember these 7 layers in the proper order, going from bottom to top and top to bottom. Now, to help you with that, I like to use a memory aid known as a mnemonic. In the case of the OSI model, I like to think about my favorite kind of pizza when I'm listing things from the bottom layer to the top layer. Now, my favorite kind of pizza is sausage pizza. So, if you want to remember these 7 layers of the OSI model, just remember what I always say about sausage pizza. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. After all, I think sausage pizza is pretty tasty, right? And so, you shouldn't throw it away and waste it. Now, by using this sentence, you can remember the 7 layers from bottom to top. Just take the letters from this sentence. Please do not throw sausage pizza away, or PDNTSPA, and replace it with the words physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. And there you have it, the 7 layers of the OSI model. Well, at least that's how I remember the 7 layers of the OSI model, but you can create your own mnemonic too. I've heard several interesting ones over the years from my students. Once, I was teaching this class of Navy sailors, and they told me their saying was, please do not tell Shore Patrol anything. For those of you who don't know, Shore Patrol is basically like the military police officers. So, I'm guessing they didn't want to get in trouble with their ship's captain, so they said, please don't tell Shore Patrol anything. Now, another one of my students told me his mnemonic was, please do not teach students pointless abbreviations, which is kind of funny since the abbreviation is what we're trying to remember here to remember the 7 layers. Whatever works for you is fine with me. Just remember that you need to memorize these 7 layers before you take the exam, because on the exam, you're going to get questions about these 7 layers. Now, you might see some easy questions like, what is the 7th layer of the OSI model? And then you'd pick out the word application. Or they might say, what layer is the session layer at? And you'll have to answer layer 5. Now, you might also get some more complex things, asking you about a device and figuring out what layer that device operates in. For example, a router operates at layer 3, or the network layer, but a hub is a physical device and it operates at layer 1, the physical layer. Because of this, we're going to cover each and every layer of the OSI model in this section of the course so you can learn which devices are used there and which protocols and other information like that. Alright, before we finish up this lesson, we need to talk about one more thing, and that's data, because networks are all about communicating data. Well, we're going to specifically talk about how data is going to be called different things as it flows through our network and as it goes through different names as it goes through those different layers of the OSI model. Now, when we're talking about data, we're actually talking about information at layers 5, 6, and 7 of the OSI model. Now, as it moves down through the layers, we're going to go from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, and we're going to change its name each time. When we're at layer 4, or the transport layer, we're going to call data a segment. When we go to layer 3, or the network layer, we refer to it as a packet. When we go into layer 2, or the data link layer, we call it a frame. And finally, when we're operating at layer 1, or the physical layer, this is where we've converted that data into ones and zeros to send it across our medium. We call this bits. Now, this is something you need to memorize for the exam as well. But don't worry, I have another mnemonic to help you remember it. This one is a simple question. Do some people fear birthdays? Now, I think that's a valid question because as we get older, sometimes people start fearing their birthday because they don't want to age or appear older. Now, again, I know this is silly, but hopefully it helps you remember the 4 types of information as they flow through those lower layers. So, if you can remember, do some people fear birthdays, that's going to give you DSPFB as your mnemonic. Now, if we add our data types, again, we always start with data and then we add the other 4 layers. We have data, segments, packets, frames, and bits. So, for the exam, it's really important to understand the 7 layers of the OSI model and how data moves up and down through the layers throughout the transmission process and what those data types are going to be called. So, with that said, let's jump into our lessons on the OSI model.